I did write this speech with an audience in mind who is somewhat familiar with some of my stuff already. I will do my best to explain a few things along the way for the benefit of those who are not. Now, this rather messy looking diagram is what I have dubbed the octopus. It is my attempt at gaining an understanding of how the regime operates. And here's a slightly less messy version. Now, I believe that getting this right is of paramount importance because a true understanding of the power structure is the first step towards bringing about a circulation of the elites. Implicit in my suggestion is that in many ways we've been playing the wrong game entirely. Don't even understand the rules of the game. So, now this model here has several similarities with a model put forward by Curtis Yarvin, some of you may have heard of, who no doubt influenced my thinking. It also differs in several very crucial respects, which I will tease out in a moment. First, I'm going to outline some of my core assumptions that went into producing this. Second, I will flesh out some general observations necessary to understand this model. And third, I will go through each of the 8 tentacles of the octopus and outline some of the ways it differs from Yarvin's model. So to begin with, let us remind ourselves of 7 key lessons from elite theory as distilled in my best-selling book, The Populist Delusion, still available from all good bookstores. I encourage you to buy it if you haven't bought it already. Now, here are the 7 lessons. I take these 7 lessons as given. But just for those of you who need a refresher, let me go through them. First, there is Mosca's law. That is that the organized 100 will always defeat the disorganized 1,000. This central principle of power is important to keep in mind at all times because it demonstrates that the anarchic idea of bottom-up power is simply impossible. In addition, as dissidents, it tells us exactly what the name of the game needs to be. Greater organization than your rivals. 100 organized dissidents should also outmaneuver 1,000 disorganized journalists, for example. Second lesson. Who says organization says oligarchy? This is, of course, from Robert Michel's. It is not only a distillation of Mosca's law, but also a reminder that power simply cannot operate without coordination. Third, contrary to what some other speakers may have said earlier, there is no genuine separation of powers. This is generally taken from Bertrand de Juvenel and from Carl Schmitt. It is also implicit in James Burnham's recognition of the managerial class. The logic of power is always towards absolutism. Powers can be theoretically separate, but if the people sitting in each of the respective offices are of the same stripe and are of the same belief system, in other words, if they are political friends, it will not matter. See also the Supreme Court telling the state of Texas and almost 20 other states that they have no standing. Do you remember that? And another lesson, there are no neutral institutions. This should be obvious to everybody sitting in this room at this stage. It also follows naturally from the conclusions of Carl Schmitt. Next, the rule of law is a myth. power is always decisionist. This is Schmidt's exception. See also the FBI raiding Donald Trump's home while refusing to investigate an entire laundry list of alleged elite crimes, which you can fill in your own examples. I'm sure you've got dozens of them. In practice, decisionism always triumphs over the theoretical rule of law. The United States has been in a state of emergency since 1917. Wilson, who was mentioned earlier on, he may have had some pretty words, but in practice, he actually grew the state more than, any president, apart from FDR and LBJ and Barack Obama came after him, but still. Next lesson, power seeks to eliminate rival castles. This is Juvenal, and it explains at a stroke why we have practically no institutions on our side whatsoever. The regime has taken over or destroyed all of them. And then finally, this is something I wrote an article on. I gave a talk at another event, and this is perhaps one of the more controversial ideas I'll mention, which is that culture is downstream from law. We tend to think that culture comes upstream from the people. Some version of this idea was mentioned earlier on. But actually, it's a top-down thing that comes from the law itself. What people call woke today is simply the enforcement of civil rights law. Culture is simply catching up to the law. Again, Martin Luther King, he may have had some pretty words, the actual effect of his actions was a massive expansion of state power over people's lives. Christopher Caldwell has written excellently on this topic in a book called The Age of Entitlement, where he lays out this case. But also recall the case of Starbucks being sued because they had the temerity to call the police on two homeless black men who would not leave the store despite not buying anything. There's a legendary YouTuber known as Frame Games Radio, lost to the mists of time. He did many excellent videos on this Starbucks case, showing how deeply embedded in the US legal system those laws were that the case rested on. So you can see the culture catching up to the law. In this country, all of this woke culture it is in actuality the culture catching up to things that Tony Blair did 20 years ago. Communications Act 2003, Supreme Court, the list goes on and on. Now, to these 7 basic ideas, I must also foreground 2 other theses for which I've argued elsewhere. First, against what I'd call the hidden hand conspiracy frame. There was a huge increase in this sort of thing during the whole period of COVID. I'm talking about secret Illuminati groups and you name your favourite ancient European families or whatever. Secretly the Queen is behind all this sort of stuff. We do not need to invent mystical third parties to explain what's going on. We can see how power functions right before our eyes. They literally tell us what they're going to do. And this is because, something which is often not grasped, power does not want to be hidden. It wants to display itself. The display of power is a source of power and control in and of itself. And leftists of all stripes know this because they are made to read Michel Foucault at university. And there is also the practical need to demonstrate hierarchy, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment. My second thesis is against what I will call pure emergent phenomenon explanations. This is, in fact, the hidden form of what I call the populist delusion. bottom-up and anarchistic explanations of power, market, society, and so on, are not only inherently liberal, much more importantly, they are wrong. But theoretically, even if it was not the case, let's just pretend you can have anarchistic, bottom-up power somehow. It just so happens that this regime that we're living under at this time centrally coordinates and disciplines those who resist orders. Now, if this was obscured back in 2010, events over the past few years should have made all of these things perfectly clear to everybody sitting in this room today in 2022. Just the COVID experience alone should have shown you that in practice. Now, let me give you a couple of recent examples of these two assumptions here that we've seen just in the past year. Do you remember when Whoopi Goldberg was told off like a naughty schoolgirl and then shown mercy by the ADL president here, Jonathan Greenblatt, in front of millions of people live on ABC News? This was a classic Machiavellian display of power. Machiavelli, if you remember, famously notes that it's better to be cruel than merciful as a rule, because the people will remember the acts of mercy if cruelty is the norm. However, the prince, remember, should delegate the acts of cruelty to his underlings, while he should be front and centre for the acts of mercy. That is why we were treated through old President Greenblatt here on television. But this display of power was doing more than simply disciplining Whoopi Goldberg. It was reminding everybody of the hierarchy. The fat, black, multimillionaire TV woman might have a lot of status in the current system, but she's below the ADL, to whom she must beg and grovel for mercy. And the ADL wants you to see this, or else it would not be on primetime television. And make no mistake that regardless of what television executives and producers might want, if Jonathan Greenblatt wants to go on primetime television, he will indeed go on primetime television. And in fact, this is already out of date because there's been another incident with Kanye West just in the past day. Well, we'll see how that goes, because I don't think Kanye West is inclined to beg for mercy. So let's see what happens. It's going to be amazing. Anyway. Now, we also saw the regime centrally coordinating when new diktats are released through their central messaging system, also known as the Associated Press. So, there was a recent example of this. The word recession now has a new meaning. Do you remember when this happened? Now, I hate to be so trite and tired as to draw on George Orwell, but it is difficult not to think of Winston Smith. Do you remember how he used to receive the orders through the pipes at the Ministry of Truth? The truth has changed. And what was really interesting in this moment, when the definition of the word recession had changed overnight, is that many journalists had already run with the story. They'd already tweeted out, oh, we're in a recession. And then they were forced to publicly apologise and walk back what they said, which was just amazing to watch happen in real time. I guess that was an emergent phenomenon too. Now, all of this said, there is some necessary complexity to note in all of this. Do I have a slide on necessary? Oh, yes, necessary complexity. First, there are emergent behaviours at the level of individuals in what the elite theorists would call the non-governing elite. They work, as the Marxist Louis Althusser would have said, by themselves. Okay? But the tempo, the incentive structure, is set by the law, and it's set top-down, organisationally. Second, there are dialectical relationships in the system which serve to make hierarchy somewhat difficult to trace. It's not always as obvious as my example just now. However, most of the time, activists who appear to be resisting power are in fact the agents of power being used to manufacture consent. And if you disagree with this, you literally believe that Greta Thunberg was an organic phenomenon, that Black Lives Matter really was a bottom-up protest movement speaking truth to power. And if you believe that, I think you're at the wrong event, to be honest. But also, it's really important to think back. You know, Martin Luther King, for example, was not a bottom-up phenomena. You know, it's Greta Thunberg's all the way down, and it has been in this regime for quite a long time. Now, before I talk you through the octopus, I must also make some general observations about the regime itself, which will further complicate the picture. It's worth asking the most fundamental question of all: who are the ruling class? Who are the elites? Who exactly are we up against? Now, if you ask 10 different dissidents this question, they will give you 10 different answers. As I'm speaking, you're all cycling your own version of that. Here is mine. There are, I believe, 3 competing factions within the ruling class. Broadly, we can call these, down the left-hand column here, the neocons, embodied in the American military-industrial complex. Second, there are what I could generally call the techno-globalists, as symbolized most vividly by the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab and his Bonn villain gear and all the rest of it. And finally, there are the third worldists, people like George Soros and his Open Society Foundation. And I think there's a tendency on our side of things to see all of these 3 as just one blob, whereas in fact they do have some subtly competing ends, which I'll talk through in a moment. So what are their competing aims, goals, and methods of operation? The ultimate aim of the neocons is to remake the world in America's image. In other words, to subordinate every tradition and culture under the lesbian stiletto heel of liberal democracy. So that you too can enjoy unlimited anal sex and a never-ending cavalcade of black people on television. Meanwhile, the techno-globalists are much more practically focused. They focus on things like energy and food and technology. Their ultimate aim is to establish a global governance structure, like the one we heard about from yourself earlier on, or even a global world government. I think that would be their ultimate dream. And finally, the third worldists, this third column here, they want to equalize the relative standings of the West and the third world. Now, in my view, the real struggle is between the neocons and the techno-globalists, while the third worldists typically represent, I think, a distraction for the left and the right to squabble over. Very generally, and I'm not saying that they don't have an influence, they do, but I'm saying that realistically they're not in the real struggle for where this beast is going. Now, very generally, I would say that the response to COVID-19 saw the techno-globalists grow their power, while the war between Russia and Ukraine has seen the neocons claw a lot of that power back, I think, really palpably. Of course, there are many elites, for example, the Dark Lord Tony Blair, who have a foot firmly in both camps. But eventually, the techno-globalists will have to see the neocons as a rival castle. In the end, these two forces will start to see each other as rivals properly. Neocons seek to maintain American brackets and Israeli hegemony, while the techno-globalists are more genuinely, I think, universalists. The neocons use the instruments of American power, while the technoglobalists use the instruments of transnational power, such as the UN, the WHO, climate change protocols, and so on. The neocon power base is what you might call the Washington swamp, backed generally by the organized, certain organized groups, let's just say, and wonk think tanks, while the technoglobalist power base is corporate, backed generally by a nebulous cluster of NGOs. Neocons typically exercise power through the state, especially the US state and the US State Department, while technoglobalists typically exercise it through corporate compliance culture. I mention this because while we might point to general tendencies in regime hierarchy, we must recognize that these rival factions operate slightly differently. Now, what I'm going to talk about is generally the technoglobalists here, but in your mind, but when you're thinking about the neocons, their power is much more vested in things like the American Army, US State Department, things like that, okay? Now, another general observation before I actually get to this octopus is that once you realize these basic functions, the basic factions and their aims and their goals, it informs what is and is not allowed within regime discourse. And therefore, it can show you what is and is not containment from the absolute point of view of power, which only cares about maintaining itself at the end of the day. Some of you may remember this rather tongue-in-cheek table I made, outlining what is and is not allowable to send. Now, while this may seem shocking to many people here, anti-trans, anti-CRT, anti-abortion, these are not particularly edgy stances, and they come with financial and professional rewards within the regime. You might even get a spot on Ben Shapiro's show or something like that if you adopted those stances. As you slide down this scale, you will see topics that are total no-go zones. We need not dwell on them. And I disavow them all. I respect the UK government and all the rest of it. We need not dwell on them. I mean, some of these things are literally illegal in some countries. So I mean, we joke, but this is also quite serious. Other than to point out that this scale is some indication of what the regime holds truly sacred and what it feels that it can and it cannot contain. There's some of these issues are allowed into the discourse, some of them are just, they will not allow any aspect of it into what Hegelians might call a dialectic or the national conversation, these other sorts of things. Now, all right, let us finally get now to the octopus. And as you can see, it has 8 tentacles. Now, I'm going to talk you through each one of them. The chest here is the beating heart. The financial system, and especially the central banks, the investment banks, massive asset management firms such as BlackRock and Vanguard, which between them manage almost $20 trillion. Now, old-fashioned dissidents used to call this the money power. The relationship between a firm like BlackRock and the US Treasury Department, which is nominally in charge of the Federal Reserve, is basically formalized at this point. It's formalized in all but official, de facto. In 2016, Larry Fink, who's pictured here, he's the CEO of BlackRock, if you didn't know, he donated something like $22 million of his own money to the Clinton campaign. And he had a team of former BlackRock staffers ready to move in, straight in to work directly for old beloved Hillary. When Trump won, it made almost no difference whatsoever. And it was widely reported that the US Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, was in daily contact with Fink, who, through the ETFs, which are now on the federal balance sheet via BlackRock, controls a large part of the US economy. Now, when Biden later got in, he installed Janet Yellen, who has an even closer relationship with Larry Fink than Mnuchin did. And as the US, and she's the new US Treasury Secretary. You look at the economy right now, this is Yellen. Now, BlackRock and Vanguard are an interesting case study of James Burnham's managerial thesis. First, BlackRock and Vanguard have no declared owners. They are simply owned by the millions of people who have their assets managed by them. And if you know your Burnham, this means that the disorganized mass of shareholders are ruled over by the organized managerial elites, as embodied in somebody like Larry Fink, who manages those assets. Thus, you see the severance of ownership and control of capital. However, note that BlackRock and Vanguard are listed. Do they have? Oh, here we go. This is fun. So BlackRock and Vanguard are listed as either the number 1 or the number 2 top shareholder of all of these different companies here. I mean, these are just the top 30, but you can just think of a brand. It's a fun game you can play. Think of a brand that you know, that you spend money on in the shops. See who their shareholders are, and you'll see the top 1 and the top 2, in almost every case, is BlackRock and Vanguard. Number 3 will typically be State Street, which is also basically owned by Black. It's kind of, they kind of own each other as well, which is so. Where BlackRock are number 2, the Vanguard Group are number 1, and vice versa. BlackRock is not only the largest institutional investor in the world through its Aladdin software, which is used by all other investors, it essentially controls the general flow of the index itself, talking about the S&P 500. Aladdin is not a neutral platform. It makes helpful suggestions on what to invest in and what not to. And naturally, ESG principles are part of its algorithm. Little Aladdin, did you know this is not green? Or whatever the little helpful suggestion might be. Many of these things are automated, of course. Thus, BlackRock and Vanguard have functional leverage over, for example, a big corporation like Microsoft. Therefore, it really behooves somebody like Bill Gates, or frankly, anybody who oversees Microsoft, I believe Gates is no longer involved in day-to-day affairs, to share the same values as these crucial investors. When Larry Fink sends his quarterly letter to the CEOs, which you should make a habit of reading whenever he releases them, it is practically like a set of orders from a Soviet commissar. Thus, the compliance culture of corporations is downstream from the institutional pressure that massive asset management firms like BlackRock can push on them. It's not coming from woke Harvard graduates who are simply the product of this power structure. It's coming from the top. If you're managing one of these, if you're a CEO of one of these massive companies, if you don't comply, they have the power to crash your share price and literally drive you out of the market. Not through, consumers buying and selling, just through the sheer number of shares that they own. And it's about 10% of the company between them. Corporations can thus be disciplined, and they could funnel their vast resources to foundations, like Ford Foundation or Bill and Melinda Gates, Melania Gates Foundation, and they in turn fund. Well, there we go. There's some more slides about this sort of thing. So yeah, so then Bill Gates, you know, Microsoft have to do something with all the billions of dollars that they earn, and they funnel a pile of it into these massive foundations. And who does this money go to? And you all know my favourite example. Bill Gates has been the principal financial backer of a certain Tony Blair, one of the world's most powerful men, since practically the second he left 10 Downing Street in 2007. What do you think of Tony Blair? He left politics years ago. The Tony Blair Institute, which just receives huge amounts of money from Mr. Gates, is the model of the modern NGO. And this makes, in my view, Blair far more powerful than whoever the current Prime Minister happens to be. Not that it actually matters, since they are all, well, there's Blair and Gates there. All of the politicians now are versions of Tony Blair anyway. Of the three front runners in the recent Toryship leadership race, Penny Mordaunt wrote a book which is explicitly praised by Tony Blair in the inside cover. Rishi Sunak was dubbed by the media the heir to Blair, while Blair himself has explicitly allied with Liz Truss, who quoted him at the start of a campaign speech at the Tory Party conference the other day. I mean, imagine, it's just, I mean, it kind of blows your mind. Even Georgia Maloney has started calling herself, oh, I'm a right-wing Tony Blair. It is remarkable. Now, the alliance between the chest and the network sit above what I call the crown. This is a thing which most of us focus most of our attention on most of the time. This other stuff happens in the background, nobody really pays attention to it, which is to say the official government. Now, bear in mind, I hadn't heard all the speeches when I say this next line. We all know democracy is a terrible system. Politicians have a very short-term planning horizon, and their eye is almost always on polls and the current news cycle. This means that in terms of actually governing, actually running things, they are extremely lazy. When it comes to policy, they essentially outsource it to these NGOs that I'm talking about. In pure elite theory terms, the NGOs are organised while the government is disorganised. The government needs a policy, for example, on the pandemic or on climate change or on whatever else, and it just so happens that the Tony Blair Institute has a 200-page policy proposal ready to go, ready to be rubber-stamped, and so then NGO policy proposal becomes official government policy, and the MPs probably did not even read it. And again, you can have a fun game by just doing basic, like anyone who's worked in academia remembers like the plagiarism things. You can just do like plagiarism tests on government policy and be like, hold on, this is like literally from this NGO white paper, you know, a year ago or 2 years ago. Yeah, how much do we have? 5 minutes, okay. In this way, what is already decided, so in this way, what is already decided is handed to the bench, which is to say, the judiciary, and it is handed to the chamber, which is to say the permanent civil service, to enact and enforce. Remember, culture is downstream from law, which means that the media and its manufacturing of consent only get the memo after this process has already taken place. This is somewhat counterintuitive. Once the nudge unit, which is located somewhere in what I'm calling the chamber, sets to work, you'll see that media outlets walk in almost lockstep compliance with whatever has already been decided. In fact, interestingly, the media will often cover these things as if they have not already been decided, when indeed they have. I'll just give you one case in point. This rather sinister paper here was published in October 2019. And it prefigures the current push for plant-based burgers, Beyond Meat. Do you remember that? It kind of didn't work, but do you remember the huge push for plant-based burgers a couple of months back? And it prefigures all of that by 3 years. The media articles championing these things not only post-date this article, but also they are part of the explicit media campaign it outlines. If you read this paper, it literally says, oh, in order to get the public to accept this, we're going to have to run like massive media campaigns to nudge them into making the correct choices. This hasn't come from Harvard or Yale. It was BlackRock-defined ESG investment strategy, World Economic Forum policy, before it was a policy proposal from an NGO, and then it became official government policy, before it became a media headline, before any of us even heard about it. If you're not paying close enough attention, it looks like the media memed this into existence, but in fact, the media are just acting as the mouthpiece for decisions that have already been taken. Who wrote this paper? A man called Dr. Richard Carmichael. He's a professor at Imperial College London, and he works typically on climate change projects that are funded by grant money. Who funds him? Well, he's got two main sources of funding. The UK government itself and a billionaire investor called Jeremy Grantham, who's something of a prototype Larry Fink, if you look into him. Now note how this is not just a bunch of crazy left-wing professors. It is actively incentivized. Themes for research are set top-down. Academics are simply the paid shills of the regime, used to post hoc generate arguments to justify what has already been decided. Whatever arguments they generate are then mainstreamed by the media and adopted, kind of almost lemming-like, by all of your friends. Thus, if we had a rough flow of power through the octopus, it would look something like this. Just in passing, the church, which I haven't mentioned, represents the captured rival castles of enemies for the regime. The church is disciplined by law and forced to become the skin suit for the ruling class and its ideology, subordinating Christ to George Floyd and the pride flag and whatever else happens to be the current thing. You can take a trip into the English countryside. Note the number of Ukraine flags flying from Church of England churches as an example of what I'm talking about. Now, I think, in the interest of time, I'll skip over how exactly this differs from the Yarvin model and just mention a couple of things in passing, which is that one of the things I'd like to do is to get away from this idea that this is just the quote-unquote left. It's been pointed out many times that the Occupy Wall Street movement, which took place in 2008, it was only after that time that this massive focus on race and racism and kind of woke values started to take place. The left is not in control. It has been utterly humiliated and tamed by the regime. Where the left once represented what you might call a threat to capital, as Marx might put it, now the left literally shears on multinational corporations and sticks up for the Walt Disney Company in the name of the right to sexualize children. They have been totally and utterly contained. The brief resurgence under Jeremy Corbyn was buried. Corbyn was buried under accusations, if you remember, of anti-Semitism. And promptly, who was Corbyn replaced by? Yet another Tony Blair cipher, Keir Starmer. So all I'm saying is that this regime has a habit of jumping to the tune of the neoliberal centre, as opposed to Marxism or kind of Frankfurt School or any of that stuff. Don't get me wrong, it uses some of that intellectual apparatus, but the interests it's actually serving are still those, broadly speaking, of what you might call neoliberalism. And I think I will leave it there. All right.